In the world of horror, the concept of the vampire has evolved in fascinating ways, as stories about immortal creatures who want to suck your blood haven't just been terrifying nightmares. They've been a reflection of society's attitudes towards outsiders, our fears of aging and death, or, more often than not, a metaphor for sex. And as society's attitude towards sex has changed over the years, so have vampires on screen. The most famous vampires from the black and white era of film are very embedded in the original story that inspired them, Bram Stoker's classic novel Dracula. While monsters like Nosferatu and Dracula were scary, there was also an erotic undercurrent to these scenes, as the predators were seen slipping into the bedchambers of innocent young women to drain their life force, awaking a new sensuality in them. Given the era's puritanical mindset towards sex in general, the messaging is pretty clear. Vampires represent a destructive, corrupting influence, delivering evil thoughts to innocent minds. But the popularity of these stories in the early years, especially amongst women, and the way that both Bela Lugosi and later Christopher Lee became icons thanks to their portrayals of Dracula, reveals how seductive these characters could be, and why Bela Lugosi, as played by Martin Landau in Tim Burton's 1994 film Ed Wood, would give this advice.
Take my word for it. If you want to make out with a young lady, take her to see Dracula.
As the classic era of film gave way to more modern interpretations of vampire stories, both films and TV shows began to explore vampires not just as terrifying yet alluring figures, but as characters capable of some humanity. Decades before Edward Cullen, our mothers and or grandmothers were pining after the tragic vampire Barnabas Collins, played by Jonathan Frid on long-running soap opera Dark Shadows. Barnabas was a vampire in need of blood, but he was also defined by a tragic romance with his lost love Josette. Dark Shadows premiered in 1967, just as the sexual revolution was underway. And when we jump forward to the 1980s, you see how vampires on screen have jumped forward with the times as well. While this is an era where abortion in America might be legal, the AIDS epidemic is also now a real issue, which means that this time there's a new element, vampires who represent not just sex, but gay sex. Tony Scott's 1983 vampire thriller The Hunger is surprisingly explicit, as Catherine Deneuve and Susan Sarandon do actually have sex in the film, and we see how Deneuve's vampire Miriam uses both the promise of eternal life and her own sexuality to lure in the meeker scientist played by Sarandon. Meanwhile, in Interview with the Vampire, Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise don't make out or anything, but the relationship between Louis and Lestat is rife with homoerotic tension, especially as they form an adorable family unit with adopted daughter Claudia, played by 11-year-old Kirsten Dunst. And in The Lost Boys, the core relationship of the film ends up being between Jason Patric as Michael, a newcomer to the beachside town of Santa Clara, and David, played by Kiefer Sutherland. Michael may have a female love interest in the form of Star, played by Jamie Gertz, but he ultimately gets seduced into joining David's gang of rebellious teen vampires. As writer Alcee Leyva describes in his essay For a Bright Wall in a Dark Room, though Michael's initial coercion stemmed from his attraction to Star, in this moment he gives himself, and is left changed by, his attraction to the Lost Boys lifestyle. The relationship of Michael to these outlying, roguish men is the central focus of the entire film. Even find out later that Star is not so much a love interest for David, but rather someone he has decided to use as a sexual lure. She serves as bait not only to ensnare Michael, but to fulfill his transformation upon her death. In other words, the only way Michael can truly become a lost boy is by literally killing his heterosexual urges. What becomes apparent is that as vampires become more relatable as characters, even becoming proper love interests, metaphor continues to be a key part of how their stories are told. In the 1990s and 2000s, many mainstream stories about vampires become a little more coy with the subject matter, using the supernatural condition more euphemistically. This was especially true throughout the run of the TV series Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where the metaphor connecting vampirism and sex was pretty specific. To paraphrase Giles, as played by Anthony Stewart Head, the subtext more often than not rapidly became a text.
This sort of thing's never happened to me before.
Maybe you were nervous.
I felt all right when I started. Let's try again.
The show's most iconic moment of metaphor comes when titular vampire slayer Buffy Summers, played by Sarah Michelle Gellar, loses her virginity to Angel the Vampire in Season 2. When the Gypsy Curse, which made the David Boreanaz character seem like the perfect boyfriend, is lifted, Angel returns to being the soulless monster he was when he first turned into a vampire. A devastating twist that warned an entire generation of young women that you might choose to go to bed with a nice hot guy, but he might turn out to be an asshole in the morning. For a completely different take on vampirism and sex, we have another franchise to consider. When Stephenie Meyer's Twilight novels were adapted for film, they kept Meyer's Mormon values, specifically the idea that sex is something that should only happen after marriage. As a result, Kristen Stewart's Bela and Robert Pattinson's Edward wait until their wedding in the fourth movie, Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 1, to do the deed, with Bela immediately getting pregnant afterwards. Arguably the least fun fictional pregnancy of all time, as Bella's vampire baby nearly kills her during delivery, and she only survives after Edward turns her into a vampire. Bela may get to be a superpowered vampire in the end, but the Twilight films might not be described as sex positive. Twilight's an odd outlier for the genre, though, as franchises like the Wesley Snipes starring Blade and Kate Beckinsale starring Underworld embrace the messy interaction of romance and vampirism, with fangs to the neck being as powerful a symbol of commitment as an engagement ring. HBO's True Blood also blended together blood-sucking and lovemaking, but in that show, the vampires are more of a metaphor for the treatment of LGBTQ+ people in America. What matters the most about this point in time is that while the themes remain consistent, these vampires are a lot less terrifying, because beyond the metaphors, we recognize them, and we relate to them. The FX comedy What We Do in the Shadows features a found family of vampires living their best life in Staten Island, and a big aspect of the series Jermaine Clement and Taika Waititi made based on their 2014 mockumentary film is how much it engages with vampire lore of the past, so much so that perhaps its most famous scene features a half-dozen actors from other vampire films and shows making cameos as their past vampiric selves. But while What We Do in the Shadows is aware of all these old tropes, it's also pretty straightforward about its characters existing as sexual beings, with its core vampires engaged in centuries-long, sex-filled marriages, or, like Nandor, forever searching for love. Here in the 2020s, vampires remain symbols of intoxicating ideas like immortality, but while they will always represent the concept of the other, it's less common for them to be monsters in these modern narratives. Instead, they're not quite living, yet still compelling characters. With the nature of the vampire on screen having evolved into its current form, though, it does feel like we're currently at the end of another era. What will the future hold for these creations? Will unforeseen societal changes mean that the future will return to the days of metaphor? Or will audiences get sick of vampires and just start getting really horny for the Wolfman? The only ones guaranteed to live long enough to find out are the vampires among us.